The letter was an answer. Though not to a prayer, Margaret had dared to speak aloud. It arrived on a Tuesday, a day of thin, grey rain that promised a damp chill to the bone. Delivered not by the post, but by a soberly dressed clerk, who smelled of ink and the city. It was a single sheet of heavy, cream-laid paper, folded and sealed with a wafer of plain black wax. An instrument of business, not of sentiment. Mrs. Margaret Hale, lately of the household of the Dowager Countess of Abernathy, deceased, read the precise, spidery script of a solicitor she did not know. To Mrs. Hale, acting upon instructions from a client, I am empowered to offer you the post of companion and governess to the children of His Grace, the Duke of Vaughan, at his seat, Larkbridge, in the North Riding of Yorkshire. The children are Master Arthur Westdale, aged 9, and Miss Cecily Westdale, aged 6. Your duties would encompass their education and general welfare. The situation has been difficult to fill. The household is one of quiet and profound mourning. The Duke has resided in strict retirement for 2 years. Applicants of a nervous or effusive disposition have not found the position tenable. The salary offered is 100 guineas per annum, with all travel and necessities provided. Should you find the terms acceptable, a voucher for your coach fare is enclosed. You may depart at your earliest convenience. The household is prepared to receive you. Yours, etc. J. M. Ainsworth, Lincoln's Inn Fields. Margaret read it twice. No mention of her qualifications, her long service with Lady Abernathy, her skills in household management, or her knowledge of herbs and simples, learned at her physician father's knee. No, the solicitor's letter was an exercise in negation. It described not what she should be, but what she must not be. Not nervous, not effusive. 100 guineas. It was a fortune. A salary offered to a desperate man for a desperate task, not to a respectable widow for the care of 2 children. The sum was its own warning. It spoke of high turnover, of frightened governesses fleeing back to the relative comforts of London. It spoke of a place where money was the only tool left to persuade anyone to come. Larkbridge. The name was a whisper in society, a cautionary tale. The grieving Duke. The man who had walled himself up with his sorrow after his young wife's long, tragic decline. They said the house was a tomb, that the Duke, Roland Westdale, was a ghost within it, a man of 36 who had surrendered to the past. Margaret looked around the small, tidy room she rented. It was clean, it was respectable, but it was temporary. Her funds, after the Dowager's modest bequest, were finite. She was 28 years old, a widow with no children of her own, and a competence that the world seemed to have little use for. She could manage a great house, balance accounts, soothe a fever, identify a failing crop from 100 paces, and command the respect of servants. But the world only saw a woman in need of a post, a dependent. The situation has been difficult to fill. The phrase snagged in her mind. It was a challenge, a problem to be solved. Other women, younger women perhaps, women of a more delicate sensibility, had failed. They had seen a ghost story and run from it. Margaret saw only a set of facts. A grieving father, 2 motherless children, a household in disarray. She was not a sentimental woman. Pity was a useless emotion, a weak tea that warmed no one. What she felt was a flicker of something else, a kinship with the problem itself. She too was in a kind of retirement, a life arrested by loss. Her own husband, a good and steady man, taken by an inflammation of the lungs 6 years prior. Her grief was a quiet, settled thing now, a piece of her own interior landscape, but she understood its architecture. She looked again at the stark, practical letter. It did not ask for tenderness. It did not ask for love. It asked for a woman who would not be nervous, a woman who would not be effusive. It asked, in its dry, legal way, for a woman who would not break. And Margaret Hale, for all her quiet dresses and sober mien, did not break. She picked up the travel voucher. The paper was crisp between her capable fingers. She would go to Larkbridge. She would take the measure of the grieving Duke, his silent children, and the house that had defeated all the others. She would take the 100 guineas, and she would do the work. It was as simple and as complicated as that. The journey north was a slow unwinding from the grey coil of London into a landscape of green and stone. The farther the coach travelled, the more the land opened up, vast and indifferent under a sky that stretched, pale and luminous, from one horizon to the other. By the time the hired carriage turned off the main post road and onto the private drive of the estate, the world had gone quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under the wheels and the lonely cry of a curlew. Larkbridge was not a tomb. It was something far sadder. It was a beautiful house that had been forgotten. Built of pale, honey-coloured stone, it sat nestled in a gentle fold of the moors, elegant and perfectly proportioned. But a veil of neglect lay over it. The long drive was rutted, the verges shaggy with weeds. The great park that sloped down to the river was dotted with magnificent oaks, but the grass beneath them was knee-high and wild. A shutter on an upper window hung askew, a broken tooth in a once perfect smile. It was a house holding its breath. The carriage drew to a stop. For a full minute, nothing happened. No groom ran to the horses. No footman appeared at the door. Then the great oak door opened slowly, and a man who could only be the butler stood there. He was old. His shoulders stooped inside his immaculate but threadbare coat. "Mrs. Hale?" he asked. His voice was rusty, as if from disuse. "I am," Margaret confirmed, stepping down from the carriage. "I am Fletcher, your Grace. Madam, welcome to Larkbridge." The slip was telling. He was accustomed to addressing only one person. "If you will follow me." The inside of the house smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and something else, the scent of stillness. The great hall was magnificent, rising 2 stories to a timbered ceiling, but it was cold. A film of dust softened the edges of the heavy furniture. The portraits on the walls, generations of Westdales, seemed to watch her progress with sombre, judging eyes. Every footstep echoed. It was the hush of a sick room, expanded to fill a ducal seat. The solicitor's letter had been an understatement. This was not a house in mourning. It was a house embalmed. Fletcher led her up a grand, curving staircase. "His Grace is indisposed. He asks that you make yourself comfortable. The children are in the schoolroom." He showed her to a suite of rooms in the east wing. A spacious bedchamber and a sitting room, both furnished with a faded elegance. A fire had been laid in the grate, a single valiant point of warmth and light in the pervasive chill. "Mrs. Crabbe, the housekeeper, will send a girl with hot water. Dinner is at 7. A tray will be brought to you here." "I should prefer to dine with the children," Margaret said. It was not a request. Fletcher's eyebrows, thin and white, rose a fraction. "As you wish, madam. The nursery wing is through that door." He gestured toward the end of the corridor. "They dine at 6. He bowed and departed, leaving Margaret alone. She walked to the window and looked out. The view was of a vast, formal garden, now a ghost of itself. Box hedges grew shaggy and untrimmed. Weeds choked the gravel paths. The skeletons of last year's roses rattled on thorny, overgrown canes. It was a portrait of despair, an estate mirroring its master. She unpacked her 2 trunks, her movements economical and precise. She was not a woman who owned a great deal. Practical dresses of grey and brown, good sturdy shoes, a handful of books, and her late father's leather-bound case of medical instruments and herbs. She put everything away, creating order in her small corner of the house's vast entropy. At 5:45, she made her way to the nursery wing. The silence here was different. Not empty, but watchful. She found the schoolroom at the end of a long hall. The door was ajar. Inside, 2 children sat at a large table in the center of the room. A boy with dark, serious eyes, and a thin, pale girl with hair the color of straw. They weren't playing. They were simply sitting, staring at a book that lay open between them, though neither seemed to be reading. They were like figures in a tableau, small and unnervingly still. Margaret paused in the doorway. "Good evening," she said, her voice quiet but clear. 2 pairs of eyes snapped up. The boy, Arthur, looked at her with a stark, unchildlike assessment. The girl, Cecily, shrank back in her chair, her expression one of habitual apprehension. They had seen governesses come and go. They were waiting for her to fail. "I am Mrs. Hale," Margaret continued, stepping into the room. "I believe you are Arthur, and you are Cecily." Arthur gave a stiff, formal nod. Cecily said nothing, her gaze fixed on Margaret's plain grey dress. A young housemaid brought in their dinner on a tray and set it on the table with a clatter, her movements hurried and nervous. She fled without a word. The meal was simple: boiled mutton, potatoes, and gravy. The children ate in the same unnerving silence, their hands moving, their eyes downcast. Margaret did not press them with questions. She did not try to charm them with false brightness. She simply sat with them, ate her own meal, and let the silence be. She was a point of stillness, but hers was a stillness of patience, not of paralysis. When the meal was over, she said, "Show me what you were reading." Arthur pushed the book toward her. It was a volume of Greek myths. He pointed a thin finger at a woodcut of Orpheus looking back at Eurydice, condemning her to the underworld. The image was stark and sorrowful. "A sad story," Margaret observed, her tone neutral. "He shouldn't have looked back," Arthur said, his voice a low monotone. "It was the rule." "Sometimes," Margaret said, meeting his gaze, "it is the hardest thing in the world not to look back." A flicker of something, surprise, understanding, passed through the boy's guarded eyes. For the first time, he looked at her, not as a governess, but as a person. It was a start. A very small start. She did not meet the Duke of Vaughan until the following afternoon. She had taken the children for a walk. Or rather, she had announced her intention to walk in the gardens, and they had trailed behind her like 2 small, silent ghosts. The air was crisp, the sun a pale disk in the sky. As they rounded a corner of the overgrown box hedges, a whirlwind of motion and sound erupted from the direction of the stables. A dog. But to call it a dog was an insufficiency. It was a canine giant, a beast of myth, an Irish wolfhound the color of a winter storm. It bounded across the lawn, a chaotic force of nature, its paws tearing at the damp turf. It was magnificent and terrifying. And behind it, a man. He was tall, dressed in impeccably tailored but starkly black riding clothes. He moved with a long-legged stride, but there was a stiffness to his posture, a rigid control that seemed at war with the wildness of the dog. His face was pale, his features sharp and aristocratic, framed by dark brown hair. He was not shouting, but his voice, when it came, was a low, furious command that cut through the air. "Cuchulainn, to heel!" The dog paid him no mind whatsoever. It continued its mad gallop, circling and barking, a joyous, deafening sound in the profound quiet of the estate. The Duke stopped, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Margaret saw his face clearly now. It was a mask of cold, frustrated fury, but beneath it, visible in the taut line of his jaw and the bleakness in his green eyes, was a profound and bottomless exhaustion. He was a man worn down to the bone. The children had frozen. Arthur stood his ground, but Cecily had pressed herself against Margaret's side, her small hand clutching a fold of her skirt. The Wolfhound, having exhausted its first burst of energy, now caught their scent. It swerved and bounded toward them, its massive head low. It was not aggressive, merely unruly, a creature of untamed instinct, but its size was overwhelming. Cecily let out a small, terrified whimper. The Duke's head snapped toward them. His eyes, the colour of deep forest moss, met Margaret's. There was no welcome in them, only a flat, cold annoyance, as if they were just one more complication in a day he could not control. "Get the children inside," he commanded, his voice clipped. But Margaret did not move. She kept a steadying hand on Cecily's shoulder, her gaze fixed on the approaching animal. The dog was a physical manifestation of the entire household, a powerful, beautiful thing lost to grief, running wild and deaf to all command. It was chaos, and Margaret Hale did not abide chaos. The dog skidded to a halt a few feet away, its head cocked, its deep chest a-heaving. It let out another booming bark, a demand for attention, for play, for something no one in this house knew how to give. The Duke took a step forward. "Cuchulainn," he bit out, the name a curse. Margaret held up a hand, a small, quiet gesture to halt him. She then took one step forward, away from the children, placing herself between them and the dog. She was not a large woman. Beside the Wolfhound, she looked fragile, but there was nothing fragile in her posture. She did not shout. She did not command. She simply looked at the great beast, her gaze calm and direct. The dog fell silent, its tail giving a tentative thump. It looked from the furious man to the still woman. She let the silence stretch for 3 full heartbeats. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with an undeniable weight, a resonant clarity that cut through the tension. One word. Enough. The effect was extraordinary. The Wolfhound flinched as if she had struck it. It lowered its head, whined softly, and took a hesitant step back. Its wild energy seemed to drain away, replaced by a sudden, confused submission. It looked up at her, its intelligent eyes questioning. Margaret stood her ground, unmoving. She did not repeat the word. She simply waited. Slowly, deliberately, the great dog sank to the ground. It lowered its head onto its massive paws, its tail giving one last, uncertain sweep across the grass before falling still. It lay there, utterly subdued, its gaze fixed on her face. Silence descended. A profound, ringing silence. The children stared, mouths agape. And the Duke of Vaughan, stood frozen, his face a study in disbelief. The cold mask of his fury had shattered, leaving behind a raw, unguarded astonishment. He stared from the quiescent animal to the quiet woman in the plain grey dress. He had been shouting at the beast for months, yelling, cursing, commanding. and she had defeated it with a single word, spoken in a voice no louder than a normal conversation. He did not understand. He did not understand how she had done it. For the first time in 2 years, Roland Westdale felt something other than the flat, grey weight of his grief. He felt a flicker of profound and unsettling curiosity. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. In the days that followed, an invisible shift occurred at Larkbridge. It was not a thaw. The frost of grief was too deep for that. It was more like a subtle change in the pressure of the air. The house still held its breath, but the intake was not quite so sharp. The Duke did not speak of the incident with the Wolfhound. He retreated once more behind his wall of cold, formal courtesy. He saw Margaret and the children at a distance, in the garden across the hall, and acknowledged them with a stiff, remote nod. But he was watching. She could feel his eyes on her, a questioning, unsettled gaze. Margaret, for her part, established a routine. Lessons in the morning, reading, arithmetic, geography. Afternoons were for practical things. She discovered the children knew nothing of the world outside their silent rooms. They could not name the birds that sang in the parkland. They did not know how to plant a seed. So she took them to the abandoned kitchen gardens. The glass houses were choked with weeds, panes of glass broken. But in a sheltered corner, she found a few cold frames that were still intact. With the help of a grudging undergardener, she had them cleared. She procured seeds from the nearby village. Radishes, lettuce, peas. She gave Arthur a small spade and showed him how to turn the soil. She gave Cecily a packet of seeds and taught her how to press them into the earth, one by one. Their hands, pale and soft, became smudged with dirt. For the first time, Margaret saw a flush of colour in their cheeks that was not from a fever. They worked in silence at first, but slowly, tentatively, the children began to speak. Arthur asked questions. Why did the peas need a frame to climb? How long until the radishes were ready? His questions were practical, scientific, a boy's hunger for order and reason. Cecily did not ask questions. She made small, quiet observations. The worm was pink. The seed was like a little stone. Margaret answered them all with the same grave seriousness. She was building a world for them. A small, ordered world of soil and sun and predictable growth. A world that made sense. One afternoon, as she and the children were weeding a newly planted bed, the wolfhound, Cuchulain, appeared. He trotted to the edge of the garden and sat, his massive form still, his head cocked. He did not bark. He simply watched them. Cecily, who had once shrunk from him in terror, now barely glanced his way before returning to her task. The beast had been tamed not by force, but by a quiet authority it recognized. It had become a silent, watchful guardian. Roland saw it all from the window of his library. The library was his sanctuary and his prison. It was the one room in the house that did not scream with the memory of his late wife, Eleanor. She had not been a great reader. The room smelled of old leather and paper, a scent of continuity, of centuries of Westdale men who had sat in this same room, looking out this same window. He did not read, not any more. The words blurred on the page. He mostly just sat, the heavy weight of his title and his loss pressing down on him. From here, he watched Mrs. Hale. He watched her move through the neglected garden, her posture erect, her movements efficient. He watched her with his children. She did not coddle them. She did not shower them with the effusive, pitying affection the previous governesses had attempted. She gave them tasks. She gave them her focused, undivided attention. She gave them respect. He saw Arthur showing her a beetle he had found, his face animated with interest. He saw Cecily, who had barely spoken a word in 2 years, tug on Mrs. Hale's sleeve to point out the first green shoot of a pea. He saw the great, unruly dog that had been a constant, chaotic symbol of his own internal turmoil, sitting like a lamb at the edge of her makeshift garden. It was unnerving. This quiet, capable woman had walked into his mausoleum of a house and, without asking permission, had begun to let the light in. Not by throwing open the curtains and declaring the morning over, but by lighting a single, small candle in a dark corner. And then another. And another. He was not sure if he was grateful or resentful. His resentment won out one evening when he found her in the library. He had come down for a glass of brandy, his nightly ritual. He had assumed the room was empty. But she was there, standing before a high shelf, her back to him, running a finger along the spines of the books. A lamp on the desk cast a warm, golden light around her, a small island in the vast, shadowed room. "The library is private," he said. His voice was colder than he intended. She turned, unsurprised. There was no apology in her expression, no fear, only a calm, direct appraisal. "Forgive me, Your Grace. Fletcher said you would not object. I was looking for a book on animal husbandry. The estate's flock seems to be in poor health." Of course, a practical reason. This woman did nothing without a practical reason. The state of the flock is the concern of the bailiff, not the governess. The bailiff appears to be the concern of the public house in the village, she replied, her tone even. "I walked past the north pasture yesterday. I saw evidence of foot rot in at least a dozen ewes." His jaw tightened. He knew the estate was failing. He received the quarterly reports from his man of business, glanced at the bottom line, always in the red, and filed them away. He had not had the will, the energy, to care. Her clear-sighted observation was an indictment of his neglect. It was a mirror held up to his failure, and he hated her for it. "You overstep your duties, Mrs. Hale." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but the sheep do not know what my duties are. They only know their feet hurt." The plainness of it disarmed him. There was no judgment in her voice. It was a statement of fact, a diagnosis. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of his wife's illness, the long years of hushed whispers, of doctors speaking in euphemisms, of avoiding the plain, terrible facts. Eleanor was delicate. Her lungs were weak. No one had ever just said, "She is dying, and we cannot stop it." This woman, this Mrs. Hale, would have. "The library contains several volumes on the subject," he found himself saying, his voice stiff. "On the lower shelves to your right. Authored by a Mr. Bakewell." "Thank you, Your Grace." She did not move to get the book. She simply stood there, watching him. "The children asked a question today I could not answer." He braced himself. A question about their mother. A question he could not bear. "What was it?" "They wished to know your name." The question was so simple, so unexpected, it knocked the air from his lungs. His name? They knew him as His Grace, or Father. A title? A role? A remote figure of authority and grief? "They see you from the windows," she went on, her voice quiet. "They know you are their father, but they do not know who you are. Arthur thinks your name might be Vaughan, like the dukedom." Roland walked over to the decanter of brandy and poured a measure with a hand that was not entirely steady. He did not want to have this conversation. He did not want this woman, this stranger, dissecting his relationship with his own children. "My name is Roland," he said, his back to her. "Roland," she repeated softly, not to him, but to herself, as if testing the weight of it. "It is a good, strong name." He turned back to face her. "Is there anything else, Mrs. Hale?" The question was a dismissal. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw past her competent, sober exterior to the woman beneath. Her eyes, a clear, intelligent hazel, held a profound and unsettling perception. She saw him, not the Duke, not the grieving widower of society's whispers. She saw the man in the room, and she was not afraid of his anger or his sorrow. "No, Your Grace," she said. "That is all." She gave a slight inclination of her head, a gesture of respect that was not subservient, and walked out of the library, leaving him alone with the silence, the brandy, and the sound of his own name echoing in the vast, empty room. That night, he dreamt of Eleanor for the first time in months. Not of the illness, not of the coughing and the wasting away. He dreamt of her as she was when he had first met her, laughing, vibrant, her hands flying over the keys of the pianoforte in her mother's drawing room. He woke with the ghost of the music in his ears, and a pain in his chest so sharp it felt physical. The grief he had walled up so carefully had been disturbed. A crack had appeared in the dam, and he did not know if he had the strength to repair it. The arrival of his mother-in-law a week later was a disaster. Lady Wilhelmina Vance descended upon Larkbridge like a storm front, all black bombazine and disapproving glances. She was Eleanor's mother, and she considered herself the chief custodian of her daughter's memory. In her eyes, Larkbridge was not a home. It was a shrine, and Roland was its high priest. His continued, profound grief was, to her, a fitting and proper tribute. She swept into the house and immediately found fault. The dust, the untended gardens, the general air of neglect. But her sharpest criticism was reserved for Margaret. "And who is this?" she demanded, finding Margaret with the children in the schoolroom. Her eyes, small and black as currants, raked over Margaret's plain dress and capable hands. "This is Mrs. Hale, Grandmamma," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. "She is our governess." "I see." Lady Wilhelmina's tone made it clear that what she saw she did not like. "Another one. Let us hope you have more staying power than the last." She proceeded to undermine Margaret's authority at every turn. She contradicted her instructions to the children, filled their heads with maudlin stories of their sainted mother, and insisted on bringing them sweet cakes and jellies at all hours, disrupting the simple, orderly routine Margaret had worked so hard to establish. She treated Margaret as a hired servant, an interloper in the sacred space of the family's sorrow. The house grew tense. The fragile peace Margaret had cultivated began to fray. The children became withdrawn again, caught between their grandmother's suffocating sentimentality and Margaret's quiet expectations. The confrontation came in the west drawing room. It was Eleanor's room, a space of pale silks and delicate furniture, preserved exactly as she had left it. Lady Wilhelmina had ordered it opened and aired, and she sat there as if holding court. She had summoned Margaret. "Mrs. Hale," she began, without preamble. "I am concerned about the children. They seem less refined than when I last saw them. Their hands are dirty. Arthur speaks of insects. It is unseemly." They are learning about the world around them, my lady, Margaret replied, her voice even. I believe a knowledge of nature is a vital part of a child's education. Their mother was a creature of art and music, of the drawing room. She did not grub in the dirt. The implication was clear. Margaret was leading the children away from their mother's memory. And this business with the dog. The staff tell me you have it following you about like a pet. That dog was my Eleanor's. It is a noble beast, not a plaything for a governess. Cuchulainn is a living creature, not a relic, Margaret said, her patience wearing thin. He requires exercise and discipline. He was getting neither. Lady Wilhelmina's face hardened. You are impertinent. You forget your place. You are here to serve this family's needs. And this family's primary need is to remember, to honor the memory of the angel we have lost. She gestured around the pristine, lifeless room. This is what matters, preserving her, not planting radishes. With respect, my lady, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a low, intense quiet. You cannot preserve a memory by stopping life. That is not honor. That is taxidermy. Your grandchildren are not ornaments for a shrine. They are living children who need to be allowed to live. Lady Wilhelmina gasped, her hand flying to her chest. How dare you? You speak as if Eleanor's life, her death, meant nothing? I speak as a woman who understands that grief is a country one must travel through, not a house one can live in forever, Margaret retorted. You are teaching them to live in the house. I am trying to show them the path through the country. You know nothing of our grief. Perhaps not, but I know a prison when I see one. At that moment, the door opened, and Roland walked in. He stopped short, taking in the scene. His mother-in-law, rigid with outrage. Margaret, her face pale but resolute. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Roland, Lady Wilhelmina cried, turning to him for support. This person has been monstrously insolent. She accuses me of harming the children. She suggests we should simply forget my poor, sainted Eleanor. Roland looked from his mother-in-law's tear-streaked, furious face to Margaret's calm, waiting one. He saw the conflict laid bare before him. The past versus the future. The shrine versus the garden. The 2 years of suffocating, static grief versus the few weeks of fragile, tentative growth. He felt the weight of his wife's memory, a debt he had been paying with his own life force. He saw the path Lady Wilhelmina offered, an endless, sterile tribute. And he saw the path Margaret offered, a difficult, painful, but forward-moving journey. He walked past his mother-in-law and stood before Margaret. He looked at her, and the house, the world, seemed to fall away. There was only her clear, steady gaze. He had spent 2 years drowning, and she was the first person who had not offered him pity. She had offered him a rope. He turned to his mother-in-law. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it held a finality that brooked no argument. Wilhelmina, he said, you are my children's grandmother, and you will always be welcome in this house. But Mrs. Hale is their governess. Her authority in the schoolroom, and in all matters concerning their welfare, is absolute. She has my complete and unconditional support. Is that understood? It was a declaration, a choice. He had chosen the garden over the shrine. Lady Wilhelmina stared at him, her mouth opening and closing. She had lost. The shock and betrayal were plain on her face. She turned, without another word, and swept from the room. The silence she left behind was profound. Roland did not look at Margaret. He walked to the window and stared out at the gathering dusk. She meant well. he said, his voice rough. I know, Margaret replied softly. Love and grief can curdle. They can become a form of possession. He turned to her then. The mask was gone. His face was stripped bare, showing only a raw, aching vulnerability. She thinks I am forgetting Eleanor. Are you? Margaret asked, her voice gentle. He shook his head, a muscle working in his jaw. No, I am just so tired of remembering her only as an illness. The last 3 years of her life erased the first 7. She was more than a cough. She was more than a patient in a bed. He looked at Margaret, his green eyes filled with a pain that was ancient and immediate. You are the first person who has come to this house who does not look at me with pity. Margaret took a small step closer. Her heart ached for him, a clean, sharp ache that was nothing like pity. Pity is for the helpless, Your Grace, she said, her voice firm and clear. You are not helpless. You are grieving. There is a difference. Pity sees the wound and turns away. Compassion sees the wound and stays. He stared at her. Compassion. The word landed in the silent room with the force of a revelation. He had been surrounded by pity, by the cloying sympathy of neighbours, the morbid reverence of his mother-in-law, the fearful deference of his staff. All of it had served only to isolate him further, to make his grief a monstrous, unapproachable thing. This woman did not turn away. She stayed. She named the wound plainly, without flinching. Roland, he said, his voice hoarse. She blinked. Your Grace? My name? I would like you to use it. It was a request, an offering, an act of trust. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Roland, she said. And the name, in her mouth, was not a title or a demand. It was a connection, a beginning. Lady Wilhelmina departed the next morning in a carriage filled with righteous indignation and wounded pride. Her absence left a vacuum in the house, a quiet that was no longer oppressive, but expectant. The choice Roland had made in the drawing-room had been a turning point, a quiet declaration of intent. He had chosen life. Now he had to learn how to live it. He began to emerge from the library. He did not join Margaret and the children in the schoolroom. That was her domain. But he appeared for dinner in the small family dining room, a room that had not been used in years. The first meal was an agony of awkward silence. The children, accustomed to his absence, stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Roland himself felt like a foreigner at his own table, unsure of the customs. Margaret acted as the bridge. She spoke of their day, of the progress in the garden, of a story Arthur had read. She asked Roland a direct question about a tenant farmer whose lease was up for renewal, pulling him into the present, into the responsibilities he had let slide. He answered stiffly at first, his words clipped, but he answered. Slowly, painfully, a new routine was forged. Dinner together became the norm. Afterward, they would sometimes retire to the lesser drawing room, not Eleanor's formal room, but a smaller, comfortable space. Margaret would read aloud, or she and Arthur would play a game of chess. Cecily, growing bolder, would bring a small stool and sit near her father's chair, sometimes leaning her head against his leg, a tentative, questioning touch. Roland would sit stiffly, not responding at first, but he did not pull away. One evening, Margaret found him in the estate office, a small, dusty room he had avoided like the plague. He was staring at a pile of ledgers, his face a mask of frustration. "This makes no sense," he said, without looking up, as if continuing a conversation they had already started. "Ainsworth's reports show the profits from the home farm declining for 3 years, yet the yields are supposedly stable. The money is simply vanishing. Margaret came to stand beside him, looking over his shoulder. The ledger was a mess of spidery script and poorly aligned columns. "May I?" she asked. He pushed the book toward her with a weary gesture. She pulled up a stool, lit another lamp, and set to work. Her father, the physician, had believed a healthy body and a healthy account book followed the same principles: order, clarity, and the ruthless excision of anything that did not belong. Margaret had learned both lessons well. For 2 hours, they worked in near silence, broken only by her occasional, quiet questions. What was the price for barley in the autumn of 18? Who is this man, Riggs, who supplies the seed corn? Roland found himself answering, digging through old papers, his mind slowly engaging with the puzzle. He watched her hands as she worked. They were not the hands of an aristocrat. They were capable, clever hands, moving with a calm efficiency. She drew up a new sheet, her penmanship clear and bold, restructuring the chaotic figures into a form that made sense. "There," she said at last, pushing the sheet toward him. "The yields are stable. The expenses have risen by 30%. Specifically, the costs for seed, livestock feed, and tool replacement, all supplied by the same 3 merchants in Thirsk, all recommended by your bailiff." The implication hung in the air. The bailiff, the man who preferred the pub to the pastures, was colluding with the merchants, inflating the costs and pocketing the difference. Roland stared at the paper. It was so simple, so clear. He had been staring at the same figures for years, drowning in them. She had made them transparent in 2 hours. "I have been a fool," he said, the words a low, bitter rasp. "You have been grieving," she corrected him, her voice gentle but firm. "It is not the same thing. Grief clouds the judgment. It makes one want to look away." He looked at her, at the lamplight catching the warm brown tones in her hair. He felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was painful. She did not condemn him for his weakness. She simply named it, and then showed him the way out. "What should I do?" he asked. The question was an admission. He was asking for her help, not the Duke to the governess, a man to a woman. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will ride out and speak to the farmer whose lease is due, Mr. Abernathy. His family has farmed that land for 100 years. You will listen to what he has to say. He will tell you the truth." The next day, he did. He rode out, not on his spirited black hunter, but on a steady cob. He found Abernathy mending a stone wall. The farmer was wary at first, his answers respectful, but guarded. But Roland did not play the Duke. He dismounted. He asked about the man's family, about the flock, about the damp in his cottage. He listened. And Abernathy, seeing the change in his landlord, began to talk. He spoke of the poor quality seed, the feed that was half sawdust, the bailiff's bullying and neglect. It was the same story the numbers had told, but now it had a human voice. Roland returned to Larkbridge that evening, a cold, clean anger burning in him. The next morning, he dismissed the bailiff. He spent the day with his estate manager, a decent but overwhelmed man, going over Margaret's notes. He sent word to Thirsk that the estate's custom was withdrawn from the 3 dishonest merchants. He was taking back control. The work was a balm. It was hard. It was concrete. It was about the future, not the past. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of purpose. He was the Duke of Vaughan, and this land, these people, were his responsibility. He had abdicated. Now he was returning. He owed it all to her. The change in him brought a new change in the children. Seeing their father engaged, present, they began to blossom. Arthur's quiet solemnity was now punctuated by bursts of enthusiastic talk about his lessons. Cecily, once a silent shadow, now hummed to herself as she played. Her laughter, when it came, was a sound so rare and precious it made Roland's heart ache. One evening, as Margaret was putting Cecily to bed, the little girl looked up at her, her expression serious. "Is father going to smile again?" she asked. The question was a small, perfect dagger to the heart. "I think so, my dear," Margaret said softly, tucking the blankets around her. "I think one day he will." Later, Margaret found Roland in the library. He was not staring into the fire, but actually reading a book. He looked up as she entered. "Cecily asked me tonight if you were ever going to smile again," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. The book fell from his hand. He looked as if she had struck him. He had been so focused on the mechanics of his return to life, the ledgers, the tenants, the bailiff. He had not considered the view from his children's eyes. They did not see a duke reclaiming his estate. They saw a father whose face was a mask of sorrow. I don't know how," he confessed, the admission costing him dearly. "It feels like a betrayal." "Of Eleanor?" He nodded, unable to speak. "Do you think she would want this?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle. "This house, these children, you all frozen in time? A monument to her absence?" "I don't know what she would want," he said, his voice ragged. "Towards the end, we didn't speak of wanting things. We only spoke of pain." The silence in the room was thick with all the things he could not say. The guilt of the survivor, the exhaustion of the caregiver, the slow, terrible erosion of a marriage by a relentless disease. "She loved music," Margaret said quietly. He looked up, surprised. "Yes, she played the pianoforte beautifully. The music room is still locked," she stated. "A simple fact." He flinched. The music room. The one place he could not bring himself to enter. It was the heart of the shrine, the epicenter of the loss. Her sheet music was still on the stand. He had locked it the day after the funeral, and had not been back since. "I cannot," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The children have never heard a pianoforte," Margaret said. "Arthur asked me what one was. He has seen it in drawings." Another small dagger? His children were growing up in a house of silence, ignorant of the very thing that had brought their mother the most joy. "You do not have to go in," she said. "But perhaps you could find the key." It was a challenge, laid down with infinite gentleness. A step, just one small step. He did not answer. He turned and stared into the fire, his face etched with a conflict that was deep and profound. Margaret watched him for a long moment, then turned and left him to his ghosts. The key was in the drawer of his desk. It had been there for 2 years. A small, ornate brass key. He took it out and held it in the palm of his hand. It felt impossibly heavy, the weight of 1,000 memories. He did not use it that night or the next, but he did not put it back in the drawer. He kept it in his waistcoat pocket, where he could feel its hard, unyielding shape against his ribs. A constant, silent question. A week later, there was a small gathering in the village to celebrate the harvest. It was not a ball, merely a supper and a country dance in the assembly rooms. For a decade, the Duke had always attended. For the last 2 years, he had not. His estate manager mentioned it, expecting nothing. To his own astonishment, Roland found himself saying, "We shall go." And then, turning to Margaret, "You and the children as well. It is time they saw a village celebration." The decision sent a ripple of shock through the household. Clothes were aired, shoes polished. A sense of nervous excitement, an emotion long banished from Larkbridge, began to stir. The assembly rooms were brightly lit, smelling of roasted meat and wood smoke. The villagers stared as the ducal party entered. They saw their duke, still in his stark black, but present. They saw his children, looking healthy and curious. And they saw the quiet, soberly dressed woman at his side. Roland was stiff, awkward, responding to the greetings of his tenants with a formal courtesy that held everyone at a distance. But he was there. He was present. Then the fiddles struck up a tune. A country dance. A farmer, emboldened by ale, came up to Margaret. "Mrs. Hale, ma'am. An honour, if you would." Margaret smiled, a rare, lovely thing that lit up her face. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. I should be delighted." Roland watched as she was led onto the floor. She moved with a surprising grace, her steps light and sure. She was not beautiful in the fashionable sense, not like Eleanor had been. But there was a harmony to her, a rightness in her own skin, that was more compelling than any conventional beauty. He saw the genuine warmth in her smile as she spoke to her partner, the easy way she moved through the figures of the dance. She belonged to herself. He stood on the sidelines, a ghost at the feast, and a feeling of profound loneliness washed over him. He was the Duke. He owned all of this, and yet he was the only one who did not belong. When the dance ended, Abernathy escorted her back, his face beaming. "A pleasure, ma'am. A true pleasure." Roland felt a sudden, irrational stab of jealousy. He wanted to be the one to make her smile like that. The thought was so foreign, so unexpected, that it terrified him. The next dance was a waltz, a slower, more intimate dance. He felt the weight of the key in his pocket. He felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He felt the future and the past pulling him apart. He took a single, difficult step forward. He stopped in front of her and held out his hand. He did not speak. He could not. Margaret looked at his outstretched hand. Then she looked up at his face. She saw the terror in his eyes, the monumental effort it had cost him to make this small gesture. She did not hesitate. She placed her hand in his. Her touch was cool and firm. He led her onto the floor. The room held a collective breath. The Duke was dancing. He was clumsy at first, his body stiff with disuse and memory. The last time he had waltzed, it had been with Eleanor. But Margaret was a steady, patient partner. She did not lead, but she guided, her presence a quiet reassurance. He began to relax, to remember the steps, to move with the music. He looked down at her. They were close, closer than they had ever been. He could see the fine, dark lashes that fringed her hazel eyes, the soft curve of her mouth. She was not smiling now. Her expression was one of grave, focused attention. She was concentrating on him, holding him steady with the force of her will. And in that moment, he knew. He knew that what he felt for this quiet, capable woman was not gratitude. It was not respect. It was something more, something terrifying and hopeful and alive. The music ended. They stood for a moment in the center of the floor, the silence of the room roaring in their ears. He did not release her hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You are welcome, Roland," she replied, her voice soft. They returned to Larkbridge late that night, the children asleep in the carriage. The house was quiet. A single lamp burned in the great hall, Roland walked Margaret to the door of her rooms. He still had not let go of her hand. "Margaret," he began, and then stopped. He did not have the words. She waited. He looked down at their joined hands. He lifted hers, and turning it over, pressed a soft, chaste kiss into her palm. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, of gratitude, of a promise he did not yet know how to voice. He released her hand, turned, and walked away down the long, silent corridor, leaving her with the warmth of his lips tingling against her skin. Margaret went into her room and closed the door. She leaned against it, her heart beating a wild, unsteady rhythm. She had come to Larkbridge to do a job, to manage a difficult house and 2 sad children. She had not expected this. She had not expected to find a man whose quiet, broken dignity would call to her own. She had not expected to feel this fierce, protective wave of something she was not yet ready to name. She had told him compassion was seeing the wound and staying. But what if staying was no longer a choice, but a necessity? What if leaving was now unthinkable? Downstairs, Roland did not go to the library. He did not go to his own cold, empty bedchamber. He walked, as if in a dream, to the end of the west wing, to the locked door of the music room. He stood before it for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He took the key from his pocket. His hand was trembling. For 2 years, this door had been a barrier, a monument to his loss. It was the border of his grief. To cross it felt like a betrayal of everything he had been, of the man who had loved Eleanor. But not crossing it felt like a betrayal of Margaret, of the children, of the man he might yet become. He thought of her hand in his, of her quiet strength, of her clear, unwavering gaze. She had not asked him to forget. She had asked him to live. With a deep, shuddering breath, he put the key in the lock. It was stiff from disuse. He turned it. The sound of the bolt sliding back was deafening in the silence. It was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He pushed the door open. The air that met him was cold and stale, thick with the scent of dust and potpourri that had long since lost its fragrance. Moonlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating a room frozen in time. A white dust sheet covered the pianoforte, its shape like a shrouded beast. A vase of dried, withered roses stood on a side table. This was the place where the music had died. He took 1 step into the room, and then another. He was across the threshold. He had done it. He did not feel a sense of triumph. He did not feel relief. He felt only a vast, hollow ache. The grief was still there, a physical presence in the room. But it was different now. It was his grief. It no longer owned him. He stood in the center of the room for what felt like an eternity. He did not touch anything. He did not pull the sheet from the pianoforte. The first step was enough. He had crossed the line. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He did not lock it. The next evening, after the children were in bed, he found Margaret in the lesser drawing room, mending one of Arthur's shirts. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. She put down her sewing without a word and followed him. He led her not to the gardens, but down the long west corridor. He stopped before the door of the music room. It was slightly ajar. "I opened it," he said, his voice low. Margaret looked from the door to his face. She saw the cost of that small action in the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "I am glad," she said softly. I cannot go in again alone," he confessed. "Will you come with me?" It was the ultimate act of trust. He was inviting her into the heart of his sorrow. "Of course," she said. He pushed the door open, and they stepped inside together. The room was as he had left it, still and silent in the moonlight. He led her to the center of the room, to the shrouded pianoforte. This was her favorite place, he said, his voice thick with memory. She could make it sing. They stood there for a long time, in the shared, silent dark. He did not need to tell her about Eleanor. The room told the story. The silence told the story. Finally, he spoke again. "The house is coming alive again. The children, they are laughing. I'm working, and it is all because of you." He turned to her, his face a mask of raw, vulnerable emotion. "You walked into my life, Margaret, and you did not try to fix me. You simply saw me, and you stayed." He reached out and took her hands. "I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if the grief will ever truly fade. But I know I do not want to face it alone anymore." It was not a declaration of love, not in the poetic sense. It was something more real, a statement of need, a plea, a partnership. Margaret looked at him, at this proud, broken man who was slowly, painstakingly putting himself back together. She saw the man he was, and the man he could be. Her choice was clear. It had been clear for weeks. She was the one who had the strength. She was the one who was whole. And so she was the one who had to speak first. "I have no wish to go anywhere, Roland," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silent room. "My place is here, with the children, and with you, if you will have me." It was not a governess speaking. It was a woman choosing her life, choosing him. He stared at her, his green eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous hope. He had asked her to walk with him into his past, and she had answered by offering him a future. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, his eyes closing as he did so. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice breaking. It was the only word he had. It was everything. Epilogue. 1 year later, the sun, a rarer commodity in the North Riding than some might wish, slanted through the tall library windows at Larkbridge, laying warm golden bars across the Turkish carpet. The room smelled of lemon oil and old leather, and faintly of the roses blooming in the newly restored gardens. It was a living room now, not a sanctuary. Books lay open on tables. A child's drawing of a lopsided horse was pinned to a corkboard. Cecily, now 7, sat at the great desk, her tongue stuck out in concentration as she practiced her letters. Arthur, a sturdy 10-year-old, was curled in a window seat, utterly absorbed in a book about Roman legions. Near the fire, the great Wolfhound Cuchulainn lay sleeping, his massive chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Margaret, Duchess of Vaughan, sat in a comfortable armchair, a basket of mending at her side. Her dress was a simple but elegant blue, the colour of a summer sky. The sober greys and browns were gone. She looked up as her husband entered the room. Roland moved with an ease that had been absent a year ago. The rigid stiffness was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He still carried the weight of his past. It was there in the gravity of his smile, in the occasional shadow that passed through his green eyes. But it no longer defined him. It was a part of him, an accommodated sorrow, not a prison. He walked with no limp. He bore no visible scar. But the wound was there, a part of the landscape of the man he had become. It had not been cured by love. It had been made bearable by it. He came to stand behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. His touch was warm and familiar. "Abernathy is pleased with the new ram," he said. The flock should be much improved next season. I am glad, she said, leaning her head back against his hand. He is a good man. Roland looked around the room, at his children, at his wife, at the peaceful, sunlit order of it all. He remembered the cold, silent tomb this house had been. He remembered the wild, chaotic grief that had consumed him. He bent and kissed the top of her head. All of this, he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. It is all your doing. She turned her head, her hazel eyes meeting his. No, she said softly. I only opened a door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it. Later that afternoon, they walked together in the garden. The box hedges were neatly trimmed. The paths were clear. The beds were a riot of colour. They passed the music room. The doors were open to the air, and from within came the sound of a simple, hesitant melody. Arthur, picking out a tune on the pianoforte. The sound was not perfect, but it was music. It was life. Roland's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers. He did not speak. He did not need to. His touch said everything. They had not replaced the ghost of Eleanor. They had, instead, built a new life alongside her memory, a life filled with quiet laughter, meaningful work, and the steady, patient unfolding of a love that had been chosen, not found. It was a love built not on rapturous heights, but on the solid ground of compassion, respect, and the shared, quiet courage of a second chance. And it was more than enough. Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.